The National Football League does not hand out longevity easily, and every single season it reminds fans of exactly how difficult it is to stay great once you have already reached the top. Very few men in shoulder pads have ever managed to stay dominant for more than a couple of seasons in a row, and that difficulty is precisely why Tom Brady's career still gets talked about like a separate chapter in football history entirely his own. But there is one active quarterback who keeps getting dropped into that same conversation over and over again, and that quarterback is Patrick Mahomes. From the moment he took over as a starter, Mahomes looked like something the league had not quite seen before. He was slinging no-look passes and sidearm throws that broke every rule coaches had taught quarterbacks for decades, and it worked almost immediately. 2 MVP trophies came his way, 3 Super Bowl championships followed, along with 2 first-team All-Pro selections. That is the kind of career arc most players spend 15 years chasing and never quite reach, and Mahomes built nearly all of it while still in what should be the front half of his prime. So it is more than a little strange that after just one season falling short of his own ridiculous personal bar, people are suddenly talking like his whole career trajectory has changed, and a newly released ESPN quarterback ranking poll only poured more attention onto that narrative. Here is exactly what that report laid out. Following 3 consecutive years where Mahomes performed at a level slightly under his usual standard, he was knocked out of the number 1 ranking, at least for this particular cycle. But pay attention to this part. He still pulled in more first-place votes than any other quarterback on that entire ballot. His overall average score landed just a fraction behind Josh Allen, a razor-thin margin by any measure, and yet roughly 15% of the voters who participated left him completely off their top 3. Entirely 15% of people voting on quarterback play chose not to place a 2-time MVP and 3-time champion anywhere near the top of their list. Think about how unusual that actually is for a player who not that long ago was widely considered not just the best quarterback in the league, but arguably the most valuable player at any position. Period. Now, to be fair, none of this is an argument against Josh Allen, because Allen absolutely deserves to be part of this conversation. He is playing at an MVP level this season. There is a legitimate case for him sitting exactly where he landed, and that is not where the confusion comes from. The confusion comes from something buried a little deeper inside that same ESPN report. According to their own reporting, nearly every single person they spoke with for this story agreed on one specific point: without Mahomes on the roster, the Kansas City Chiefs would likely be looking at a 3-win season, maybe 4 on a good year. That is close to a unanimous consensus among people who cover this league for a living, stating plainly that this one player is the difference between a competitive franchise and a bottom-of-the-league team. And yet somewhere inside that same voting pool, one person ranked him 9th out of 10 quarterbacks on the list, 9th place, second from the very bottom, for a player that the same voters just admitted is single-handedly propping up his entire franchise. Unless whoever cast that particular ballot happens to work in the front office of the Buffalo Bills, it becomes really difficult to make actual sense of that decision, because if you take an honest look at where quarterback play currently stands across the league, there are simply not 8 players better than Mahomes. Right now, you would struggle to name 8 players better than him at any position across the entire sport. And here is the part that deserves real attention. This is not a story about a quarterback in his late 30s who has clearly lost a step, who is missing throws he used to make without thinking twice. This is not a decline. This is one single season underperforming relative to his own historically absurd standard, and a large portion of the blame for that season belongs to the team built around him, not to what Mahomes actually did with the ball in his hands. Take a moment to consider everything this man has already accomplished while working with less than ideal circumstances around him. He has taken receiving corps that analysts openly labeled as below average and still guided them deep into the postseason. All the way to Super Bowl appearances, he has played behind offensive lines that allowed far more pressure than any franchise quarterback should have to deal with, and he still found ways to close out championships in spite of it. At this stage of his career, it genuinely feels like the only accomplishment left on his checklist is finding a way to throw himself a touchdown pass. So stepping back and looking at the complete picture here, a 9th place ranking for a player with that resume does not just feel like an overreaction. It feels almost impossible to justify with a straight face. Yes, he still finished in 2nd place overall across the full poll, and that in itself says plenty about how respected he remains around the league. But when one extreme outlier vote like that is sitting inside the mix, it becomes pretty easy to see how that single ranking may have been enough on its own to cost him the top spot entirely. And here is something worth thinking about if Mahomes ever needed one more reason to walk into this upcoming season with something extra to prove. This might be exactly the spark that does it. The Chiefs have reloaded talent around him during this offseason. The pieces are back in place, and a report like this one that on the surface still praises him while quietly burying a result like a 9th place vote inside it is exactly the kind of thing that competitive players tend to remember long after the story stops trending, because at the end of the day, polls and power rankings come and go every single year. They shift depending on who is asked, and when they are asked, opinions change week to week, and every voter is entitled to see the game through their own lens. But production on the field, has always had a way of settling arguments that debate shows and preseason rankings simply cannot, and if history has proven anything about a competitor like Mahomes, it is that doubt, even the quiet kind buried deep inside a list most fans will forget about by next month, tends to turn into motivation rather than discouragement. So maybe the real story coming out of this entire report is not actually about Josh Allen claiming the #1 spot, even though he has clearly earned that recognition this season. Maybe the real story is that Patrick Mahomes, one of the most accomplished quarterbacks of this entire era, is heading into another season with something to prove all over again, and if that one buried 9th place vote ends up being the exact thing that pushes him back to the top of next year's rankings, then whoever cast that particular ballot may have handed Mahomes and the Chiefs a bigger gift than they ever intended to give. Football as a sport has a famously short memory for excuses, but it has a remarkably long memory for players who take disrespect and turn it directly into fuel, and if there is one consistent pattern we have watched play out since Mahomes first took over that starting job in Kansas City, it is that pressure has never once made him shrink. He has thrived in the most important moments of the biggest games against the toughest defenses this league has thrown at him. One difficult season combined with a single questionable ranking is not nearly enough to undo everything that came before it, and if anything, those two things together might just be quietly setting up the exact kind of response we have all learned to expect from him by now.